Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Knowledge Exchange webinar. We appreciate you taking the time. We're kind of, I guess, mid-year now, and we started thinking about, what's going on with the animal protein space this year, and figured we kind of ask the question, what's going on the grill this year? So far, what we've seen, and thinking about just ahead of Independence Day, what folks are excited about seeing in ads and otherwise. So for this webinar, I have two guests with us today. Glad to be joined by Chris Dubois from Circana. He's going to provide some insights for us on what they're seeing from the consumer this year, purchasing behavior. Circana, for those that are unfamiliar, they track retail sales data, and I think they're doing food service now too with the combination. But glad to have Chris join us, and also asked Dave Weaber with Terrain Ag to join us on the webinar this year. He's going to be talking about beef a little bit, what we're seeing in the cattle space, and how that's influencing customers. Also, he's dug into some of the retail ad data, going to give us some insight there. Finally, I'll kind of wrap it up with pork and poultry and what we're seeing there. So pleased to present this, and appreciate any conversation that comes along the way. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, and keep some conversation going around the grilling season. So.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first polling question. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that now. As you can see on your screen, the question is, what is your favorite food category for Independence Day? Again, over to the right-hand side, you should see the poll that just opened. Go ahead and click a radio button on your answer. We have beef being A, B is pork, C for chicken, and poultry, D being lamb, E being fish or seafood, F is the plant-based, beyond, etc. And or if there's another food category that again that you personally plan to engage with regarding food for Independence Day. All right, looks like
for those doing it, there is a right answer. So yeah, put some care into the answer. I'm kidding, but anyway.
Not to sway anybody, but I'll say that we've been thinking about the top three there as our choice. Haven't made any decisions yet for this year, but traditionally in the Earnest household, it's been barbecued chicken. Hickory smoked barbecued chicken has kind of always been the norm, but we'll see if that changes this year. So.
All right, looks like we got just 4 more people in their progress. Again, just hit that submit button once you click on your option. And let's see what the results are looking like. All right, so there's the results over here on your right. You would see it looks like the predominant winner is beef. There you go.
Must be a lot of people in the Denver market with some hot ads going on this week.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn this presentation then over to Chris. I'll give you those presentation rights, so just give me a second here, and we'll get going.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks, Brian. It's a real pleasure to be here. At any time I have a chance to kind of address this audience, it matters an awful lot. And, for those of you who don't know Circana, and Brian mentioned it, we see every item sold every day in every supermarket, but also every other store. So think about it, every item that scans over in any supermarket across the U.S. We also track panelists, so we know 100,000 people share everything they buy, if you can imagine that, plus everything about their household. So if you want to tie household data together, in addition, we have 500 million frequent shopper cards. So for anybody pausing and starting to look in their wallet or their, behind their phone, like, yep, that frequent shopper card. So we see the buying behavior at a detailed level. And then we have people who do a lot of other things, like they share their restaurant meals with us, their receipts. So we pull together food service data in a very unique way. Plus we track volume coming out of the Cisco's U.S. Food, Performance Food Group, et cetera. So the data you're going to see here is very rich, but it's used by manufacturers to work with retailers and for retailers to help run their businesses, but also work back and forth. And that's part of how you see things get on the shelf. what we've seen, for the last few years is inflation has been the biggest story, but as you can see, it's been coming down. So this is sort of a first quarter look. We're breaking it into away from home. So if you look at away from home, it's still pretty high on that side. So if you've been going to restaurants over the last 18 months, you can feel it and see it in terms of prices. But at home, the numbers have been lower. So we kind of do that on an item by item level. So despite the pressures that consumers have been under, that's subsiding in a fast way. One of the ways, and this is one of my favorite charts, is sort of looking at who's advantaged, who's disadvantaged. So for the last 4 years, consumers have flipped the kind of historical trends, and food at home has become more prevalent. We've seen a massive shift to food at home. But part of that in the last year in particular, it's been because there's a huge price advantage for food at home. A meal at home does cost substantially more, and you can see in terms of how this goes. So the purple line above shows food away from home inflation. Think all restaurants from fine dining down to QSR. And then food at home is a composition of the meals. So we see from what people keep track of in their diaries or online in this sense, they share what they eat, so we can track the cost, and you can see the cost per meal going. So anyway, food at home is advantaged, and it's continued. Now we'll see what happens with value meals kicking into QSRs and some of the other big cases coming, but that's sort of what we're looking at in 2024 here. So from a inflation side, it has been a big deal. And to be honest, protein or the proteins as well as some of the perimeter categories led it up in 21 to 22. But when you compare the price changes over the last, from 22 and 23 in particular, the beef and veal, pork, poultry, substantially lower, than previous years. In fact, lower on average. So what you're seeing from a consumer side is, yes, there's a lot of pain in some cases from the higher than expected costs long term. But from a meat side, if you talk to a chicken processor, they would love to see higher prices. If you talk to a pork farmer, they would love to see higher prices. So prices from a consumer side are pretty advantageous. And here is a good comparison of what I would call a cost per eating occasion. So if you think about what it costs to go eat at a restaurant, and this is a composition of all restaurants on this side from our CREST data. So all the food away from home in the restaurant world. And then if you look at the diary data, what do people eat at home? So literally, if you kind of took the price of the chicken plus the price of the rice or vegetables, whatever people are cooking, and divide by the number of people in that household, which we know, you can pull up the cost per eating occasion. What you see is that gap is increasing over the last few years. And this is that pressure that you see on away from home or restaurant prices that have increased over time, but the cost per meal over 23 and into 20, from 22 to 23 just didn't really increase all that much. So the value is still in the supermarket, but it's a stark difference, to be honest, when you see this trend. One of the pieces here is, frankly, where people have shopped has undergone one of the biggest changes. Now, I could spend 10 to 20 minutes on this topic. I could spend a lot more in a lot of cases. If you start walking stores and going through kind of category by category what's going on. But if you look down here if you look at the hot pink numbers, that's basically Walmart and Target for the most part, Mass and Supercenter, plus some other smaller chains that go in there. Those are massive shifts in terms of where we've seen people shopping. This is at a real rate, almost $1 trillion worth of spending. So when you see a 2 percentage point move and $1 trillion, it's a really, really big deal. So part of the reason the cost of meals at home has shifted. Part of it's because people are shopping in different spots, whether it's Aldi, Walmart, or other places, and that shift is likely to continue. Everything we hear from how people are shopping and using e-commerce says that they're using it very, very, very proactively. In other words, people who would say, I've never gone to Walmart, but I will send an order in and go pick it up so I don't have to go in the store. that audience is growing. So Walmart's winning in different places without even people coming into the store, which is amazing. So they might say they've planned it that way. On the other hand, it's happening. But here's a quick look in terms of where things are mid-year in 2024. So right now we're running, if you think of the fresh meat world, and this is not processed but fresh, it's running about 70 billion here in the US. And in 2023 and 22, we saw we had price volume declines, which is really hard if you start anniversarying these. But what we're seeing here now is a growth in volume for the first time in 3 years. So from the impact on the meat department, that's a really big turnaround. In fact, we've seen things stabilize now on the retail side, and they're getting stronger. When you look at the beef markets, and I know Dave's going to go into that pretty deep, and I'll touch a little bit on the consumer side. Not only is it the biggest, but it's growing in dollars and growing in pounds, despite having one of the highest price per pound numbers that we've seen in a really long time, partially because of sort of the numbers of heads of cattle that are available. But nonetheless, we're seeing a really robust market, and consumers have not pulled back. So what happens when you raise prices a lot in beef? Well, apparently people keep buying. It's sort of a takeaway. The same thing for chicken. We've seen chicken become really advantaged here, and pounds are growing. So in a very tough market, a very competitive market, beef and chicken continue to drive in a very big way. And even turkeys perked up quite a bit here. So the complex is pretty strong. And this is a big turnaround from previous years. When you look at what's growing, to me, this is always one of the big fascinating pieces in terms of, of what's really driving the growth. And one, just to go to the top, ground beef, it continues to really grow. This isn't just your biggest numbers growing a tiny fraction. This is a big number growing, 8.2%. So if you think about, can giant categories really move? Sort of like think about an offensive lineman running a super fast 40-yard time. Like, yep, this is exactly that. Sales are up 8.2%. So beef can be really strong. In fact, you're seeing beef be in this among some of the top subcategories here, despite high prices. So it tells you the consumer base is strong, the economy is strong. It means people are working and they're spending money. And again, if you've been in an airport recently, you see a ton of people, they're traveling. So the strength of the economy is there, but you can see it in terms of the mix of beef, chicken, and pork and what's driving it. One of the things, in fact, Brian and I and Paul were talking about this before. One of the things we see when we see all the different baskets of things that people buy is you can see what people are buying more and less of. So the way we think about that is what's winning, what's losing, or we call it net gains, net losses from shifting. And some of that, is broken down on the left side here. Sometimes people actually buy a lot less of a category, and you can see what those numbers are. Then you can see people that are coming in new who haven't bought in the category for a while, or people who are lost, which we define as people who haven't bought in the last, who haven't bought in the last year. So people go in and out of these categories, but the net shifting is that top line. What's still amazing is beef continues to pull in, despite very high prices. We all see it on the shelf, but the product quality is there. The herd quality is there, and frankly, the product on the shelf continues to be fantastic. And again, if I had to go back to Brian's not a 101 economist, but if I'm a 101 economist and someone said, what happens when you raise prices 30 or 40%, I would have guessed volume comes down. And frankly, I would have been wrong. So what's happened here is people continue to buy. This is sort of a different view within chicken, but part of the reason too that we're seeing ground beef. So one of the things that kind of pops up, and I get a lot of questions on, why is ground so strong on this side? Or why is ground beef so strong? Like, my goodness, haven't we been grinding beef forever? And doesn't everybody have the recipes? And who's buying more of it and why? Well, one of the things we track is how long does it take dinner to get fixed? So we measure it in terms of time, in terms of, hey, no prep, it's actually cooked for you, or you're pulling it, it's a rotisserie chicken hot from the supermarket or whatever. And, so if it's a 10-minute piece, it's a fast dinner fix, all the way up to it could take 45 minutes plus. But what we're seeing is a shift going to the faster dinner fix times. So one is people are much more mobile. So coming out of COVID, we've definitely seen that. The other one is the rise of Gen Z and millennials. So millennials are, have older kids. There's a lot going on. Gen Z now is in the population mix. They are buying groceries in a pretty big way, and there's a substantial part of that generation there. What that means is that buyer composition is changing the way dinners get fixed, and that means that the meats and cuts and everything else has to change. So the whole idea of, am I going to buy a whole bird chicken and watch it 2 hours in the oven roasting? It happens less and less every year. So, if you think about what that means from a grinds growth, basically the entire complex is growing. It, in a way, it almost doesn't matter whether you're beef, chicken, turkey, pork, or lamb. Likely you're finding growth. So the good news is if you can make, grinds win because of the flexibility. But again, these are pretty big numbers. If you went out to any other category like ground turkey and said 1.9 billion, like you're bigger than a lot of the other categories you're going to walk up and down on center store on. So these are big categories even on their own. So the idea that these categories can grow 8, 11, and even 5%, that kind of bit, it's a really big deal. But it speaks everything about where consumers are today. One of the things that's probably the most perplexing part is if you think of what's driving beef out there. One is 88% of the households buy it. More people buy beef than chicken, frankly, at least from a household side. And when you think about who's a heavy beef consumer and the fact that it's really expensive, an easy guess might be, well, larger households aren't going to buy it because it's really expensive, right, to feed per person. Or you'd say, if I'm going to raise teens, I might buy a lot more chicken, not beef, just because it's more expensive. You could guess that, right? It'd be a very fair guess. But the answer is you'd be wrong. So when we look at what this index means, what it means is 5+ person households buy 28% more beef than the US household average. That's how you'd read this. So Gen X, meaning me. So I like to highlight Gen X because Gen X gets overlooked all the time. No one really cares about Gen X. They talk about boomers, millennials. So I highlight Gen X when the numbers fit, but in this case it does. So Gen X households buy 11% more. Life stage, meaning that they're raising teens. Households with teens by 25% more. Now, Brian might say that, hey, kids eat a lot more. Have you ever had a teenage boy and have you ever seen what they eat? And the answer is, well, yeah, I get that. So when you look at what matters, that's it. The other one is when you start breaking down buyers. Now, if you took 88% of the households here in the US and you ranked them from high to low, how much beef did you buy last year? And yes, we can do that for the most part. What we can do then is break them into different groups and say, let's take the top 9%. I mean, top 10 gets you pretty close, but the top 9% of beef buyers buy 36%. So if you're a retailer or you're a processor of beef, if you want to find the biggest buyers, they are very, very findable out there if you want to market to them. So knowing which stores by households and which cuts matter, you can absolutely get there. That's a 4x number just based on that. So think about the power of the heavy buyers and how that drives volume, but it also drives value. So you think, now beef is expensive. Let's just start with choice. But Angus beef is more. Nothing wrong with it. It's a great breed of animal. The marbling is fantastic. The taste can be great. But what happens, but the question is, does premium beef really drive anything? Does that make a difference in the store? And that was one of the questions I just recently had. So we did some analysis behind it. When you find out, when we did the work, we found out that Angus beef drives baskets that are 11% bigger on average. So people who buy Angus beef buy a lot more in the store. So the premium beef consumer really matters to retailers. It is a big deal in terms of if retailers win those, they're winning a lot of extra dollars in these categories over here. And again, you'd read these as an index. So
that's an awesome point, Chris. So if I'm a retailer and I have Angus beef on my shelves, that's telling me I'm going to have bigger baskets all around, right? More spend.
Yep. So it plays more than just you're going after a quality piece. Sometimes people think about it as only that you only want to go after people who buy quality, but in this sense, you're getting the bigger basket and probably the loyalty behind it. The other side is when you think about beef growing, there's different elements of it. So the grass-fed complex, it's small, to be real honest. It's only about 1.5 billion out of that 37, at 37, but it's growing at 18%. Like anything that grows at 18% or 29% for the last 4 is like, whoa, something's going on. So part of this is there's imports coming in from other countries and they show up in club stores and different places like that. Nothing wrong with it. It's a great product. But it really matters. And you think, well, shoot, if beef's expensive, well, organic beef has to be more. And your answer is right. And does organic grow faster than total beef? Gosh, that's really expensive. How could that happen? The answer is, yeah, it does grow faster by a lot. So some of this is because of what Sam's and Costco and club stores are doing with some of the product. Like you can find saddle packs. Think about 1 pound packs, but in a three pack thing or 4-pack. And the pricing can be really aggressive. You could see it in the $4.99, $4.96, something like that along pricing. But what we're seeing is number of households buying it going up, dollars going up. So the fact that the economy's been pretty strong and we're seeing people buy it, but it shows up in different ways. And some of the things here too, from a chicken side, now I've kind of hit beef because I knew beef, I was going to guess. So let me put it this way. I thought beef was going to be pretty high on that polling list. So I wanted to hit some beef questions, but chicken had to be there too for people. And then Brian wasn't kidding on the hickory side. I've heard that story and I would actually love to come down and try it at some point. But if I look at chicken thighs, they've been one of the boneless chicken thighs have been one of the biggest growth stories here in the U.S. supermarket. So it's gone from being about a $50 million category not too long ago to well over 700 million. So one of the biggest, most successful categories of products inside the store. So from a boneless chicken thigh thing, that's a big, big deal. But chicken thighs are really growing. So if you're a retailer or a chicken processor like a Purdue, a Sanderson, Tyson, Foster, you got to be running chicken thighs. Whoever's winning here is probably winning in the chicken case because that's what's really driving the growth. And that's one of the biggest determinants of who's really succeeding. In fact, that whole bone-in versus boneless discussion, you can see where the trend is going. It's been that way for a long time, but if you look at percent of bone-in fresh chicken subcategories, overall bone-in is sort of 28% across all of fresh chicken, but it makes up bone-in makes up 2% of chicken breast and about 35% of thighs. So if you could imagine growing chickens without bones, man, that would be nirvana if you could pick that out if you're a chicken processor, because then you don't have to worry about deboning it. But where the consumer is going is in chicken, totally less bone-in. And so if you wanted to target them, this is a similar matrix to what we talked about in beef. So the same index thing holds. But who buys the most chicken? Who are the heavy fresh chicken consumers? Raising teens, this number pops really big. So households with teens, that just means households with teens spend 47% more than the average U.S. household. Same thing for 5+ person households. They buy 45% more. 100 would mean, if you had 100, it would mean you're buying the same as an average U.S. population. And that kind of brings me to the end of all this. So I hope this gave you a good view of kind of what's going on the grill. My view is it was going to be chicken and beef. It doesn't mean I don't love pork, but it just meant I was going to kind of lean if the vote went that way. And that's a good view of not only who's buying, but a little bit about what's going on behind those categories from a consumer side. So Dave, do you want to take it away?
Sure thing. Thanks, Chris.
Hey, Dave.
Great insights. And my data is we're going to be able to move through it pretty quick because it mirrors a lot of what you just went through on beef, maybe looked at just a little bit of a different way. So as we get started, I think, Brian, you got slide control here. If you want to skip through this first one and maybe the next one.
Sure. Before we go there, we had a couple questions come in. Maybe we could get to those real quick before we start thinking about the fundamental side of it. We had a question kind of on thinking about pork. Taylor's saying why do you think pork is struggling to experience the same growth as beef and chicken? And Chris, maybe I'll hand it over to you if you've got some thoughts there. I've got my own, but
Yeah, sure. Those are hard questions, and there's a lot of different dimensions to those. I mean, honestly,
sure.
so I would say trying to keep it real simple and easy without going to like a 30-minute discussion on the whole thing, which nobody would really appreciate. Yeah, the first thing is I think there's been a challenge from a generational side. So pork is not a favorite of millennials and Gen Z. In other words, they buy a lot less than the US average. They over-index on chicken. So as millennials age up into the 40s and 30s and they've got households, pork hasn't been able to catch up to that. And part of that also comes down to a lot of the big cuts around ham and some of the big fresh pork roasts and things like that are just inaccessible for smaller households, like faster cooking times, to be really honest. So if you think about how fast can I get a meal on the table, and I'm looking at a big pork roast, like that's not gonna. Those things don't work well. So the challenge to me from a pork side is making those cuts a lot more convenient and just accessible for consumers is a big key to driving growth. But the number one dashboard, if I had to think about what number do I want to look at all the time and just obsess about, is getting younger generations in the boat, behind it. So
That's kind of where my mind gravitated. I know you and I had this conversation a couple times, thinking about those bigger cuts, and convenience and value kind of go hand in hand, and chicken seems to be kind of pushing more of that narrative and making it available, and then beef really just kind of on the premium side, it continues to draw consumers, is kind of where my mind goes on that. So that makes sense. The other one, real quick, we'll ask, and then we'll get on to Dave. Chris was asking, can you speak to whether the growth in chicken thighs is driven by price or taste preferences?
it's a great question. So chicken thighs from a bone-in side have traditionally been sort of a lower price cut, but most of the growth, almost all the growth, is being driven from boneless thighs. So what we're seeing is since 2018, I think we picked this as one of the big growth areas and growth pockets. And the reason is you see, one, younger generations really get behind boneless thighs. In other words, there's a taste, there's a real preference for it, for the darker meat side. Two is there's a health and wellness halo that comes over. If you track social media and you pull down all the social media pieces around chicken thighs in particular, that there's more vitamins and minerals. Now, I'm not a food scientist or a nutritionist, but there's a health and wellness aspect that kind of kicks in from a protein side towards that. And then there's I hate to call it ethnic, but there are different sort of groups out there that will over-index towards dark meat, because those countries have over-indexed with dark meat historically. So what we're seeing is the mix changes in the U.S. You're seeing the mix of buyers change, and it's no longer just a chicken breast market. It's a much more diverse market in terms of cuts and white meat. So there's multiple different tailwinds behind dark meat chicken, and frankly, I wouldn't be surprised to see chickens grown just like chickens were grown. I'm going to try to say it because I'm not a veterinarian or geneticist. Chickens were grown to make breasts bigger and more accessible, from a processing side decades ago to help drive that market. It would not shock me to see chicken thighs, be something that people are breeding chickens for, to be able to drive growth around that, because they can get more poundage ultimately out of that.
The other thing I'd add in there is from the processor standpoint, there's a huge margin opportunity in boneless, skinless thighs, especially now. You're seeing, folks that have used the product take to it, but with the decline in exports right now, there's more of that product kind of sitting in the marketplace from a leg quarter standpoint, and packer processors have a lot of opportunity to, either sell really cheap bagged leg quarters or figure out a way to add some value to that in the plant.
Yeah, for people who are behind the curve on deboning, I think they're probably working hard to catch up on that side. And there were some processors that were probably ahead of it. I can't name names, but the numbers sort of play it out that way.
All right. Well, sorry to sidebar. Good questions, though. Keep them coming. Dave, we'll switch to you. We on this slide?
Yep. Let's go to the next one. That's just
All
our
right.
disclaimer. Just says I'm not your accountant or your lawyer, and don't trade futures based on what you hear today. Kind of the story I'm going to present real similar to what Chris did in terms of where beef's going. Highlighting in particular, supplies are tight from an inventory and headcount standpoint. We've got the smallest beef cow inventory since the early 1960s. Smallest total cow numbers since the 1950s. So if you include the dairy cow numbers in that mix that are a big part of beef production eventually, and their progeny, half of them being traditionally steer calves or bull calves that turn into steers that go into the fed cattle supply, make up a big part of that as well. So moral of the story, very tight supplies, the smallest, at least guys my age and younger have ever seen in our careers. And the other problem we've got is cow culling continues. We're continuing to move cows out of ranches and off of pastures at a still liquidation pace. We're down about 14.5–15% on beef cow slaughter on a year-to-date basis. The challenge with that number is, it's way down from a year ago, but it's still bigger than the number of beef replacement heifers we have coming into the herd. So if you think about those heifers that we bred last summer that came in and calved this spring, that number is still smaller than what it would take to offset the cow slaughter number. And that looks like it's going to continue as we move into a more La Nina focused weather pattern. We're transitioning out of El Nino, at least from a forecast standpoint. The climate guys that I follow, they're all in lockstep. I think we're going to be in La Nina conditions late summer, early fall. That's a headwind for a rancher when he looks and says, how much hay do I need if I'm going into a drought again? And we just spent, I had the opportunity to spend the last 2 weeks in the country with cow-calf producers. I found 2 out of probably 200 operations that were willing to admit they'd added cows. One by accident, because he didn't cull as many cows as he thought he was going to. The other one on purpose, because he had a son coming back from college and wants to be in the cow-calf business. So good for them. Luckily, they were in, both those guys are in the central part of the sandhills of Nebraska and have the best grazing conditions in the whole country and putting up lots of hay and those kind of things. So it's not a very robust expansion. In fact, it's not expansion yet. And that means we've got some production headwinds coming for the next couple of years. If you want to advance here for us, Brian. Here's forecast for fed cattle slaughter. I've just got 2025 on here. The tightest point for fed cattle slaughter and beef production, probably 2025, 2026. Slaughter so far this year down 5%. We're still working our way through some pretty significant on-feed populations with heavy weights. The challenge feed yards have had is sourcing replacement cattle at reasonable prices. We've been putting cattle on feed with record break evens. Cattle feeders typically look at that as a high risk opportunity, and as such kind of put the brakes on in terms of the number of cattle they want to put on feed, and would rather feed longer the cattle they've got. So if you keep the inventory you've got, you kind of know what the break even is. The more days you put in those, incremental cost of game helps you out in terms of profit opportunity. And if you're looking at it from a yardage and feed milling standpoint, as those 3 separate enterprises in the feed yard, the cattle, the feed mill, and the pens themselves, you get the same yardage on those cattle that you would have on replacement cattle, but big cattle eat more than light cattle. And so you get a kick in efficiency in the feed yard from a milling standpoint that eventually over time matters. And that's part of this transition we're going through. If we look at the last couple of weeks, we've started to see that transition towards tighter supplies. We've seen packers being willing to go out and maybe buy some more cattle in a rush. And then, then they turn the corner and said, hey, we need to add some more hours too. So we've got the next couple of Saturdays, 3 Saturdays actually, ahead of us with additional hours coming. That's a response to what they see in the beef market, which has been coming up as well. Brian, if you'd kick us to the next slide here, maybe. Here's a quick look at prices. I apologize. This is not as rosy as a chart as I could have put in there because now we have $2 cattle have traded in the 5 areas. or the 5-state area. So we've got record fed cattle prices going on. We've got record prices in terms of things like if we look at 90 lean trim that comes out of the cow side. Chris talked about a little bit. That ground beef component's a strong driver to what's going on the cow side, because when we look at what those cull cows that are leaving the herd are worth, cow-calf guys are saying if I can get that kind of money out of a cull cow, it cheapens up her replacement's cost. So there's some of that turnover of inventory going on just because of the high price of the reclamation value of that female leaving the herd, and that's all driven by lean trim prices. Prices on the right, box beef prices continue to rally. We're in not record pace, but top 5, depending on what week we're looking at here, in terms of prices here in June. And that's really driven by this acceptance of really our product that's changed so much in the last 20 years from a quality standpoint. We're driving that value through the system. With ground beef prices where they're at, we're seeing lots of chucks and rounds moving into the ground beef sector. When I was in the packing business in the mid 2000s, the pricing manager that took chucks and rounds and put them in a grinder got hit on his product realization. I don't think that's the case today. There's a lot of value in ground chuck and ground round, and opportunity for customers. Still see data in the industry from research that's been done that about half of the pounds that go through the system go through as ground beef. That includes retail and food service. So there's a lot of ground beef that gets made through the system. Brian, our next slide, please. Looking at kind of that backdrop of probably higher prices for longer, with the expansion coming not this year. So if we back up and think about how long it takes that system to move, if we didn't keep heifer calves in any numbers last fall, we started the expansion, but it got short-circuited this spring. In March and early April, those heifers were worth so much money as unbred females to go to the feed yards. Producers that were thinking of making $200 or $250 a head, after they've put a summer's worth of grass, bought bulls, bred those females, they could make $400 selling them to the feed yards before they did any of that. My typical advice to them, especially depending on where they're at in the country, was take the money and run, because if you kick the can another year for expansion, that adds us almost automatically another good year of prices. So that transition, instead of looking at 2025, 26 as when prices kind of peak and production starts to come up, we've probably moved that into 2026, 2027. So it's kind of like turning the Exxon Valdez. It takes a long time once we see the need to turn, and that process has yet to start in earnest. Take that and set it on one side as, that's going to support prices. We can see what's happened to prices already on the retail front, reaching record prices last summer. We've come off that a little bit and then started back up here this spring and early summer. You would think, and us going into it, we thought, hey, there's a chance that consumers are going to trade out of beef because we've got such a huge gap between us and the competing meats. That's not happened. Actually, and Chris's data showed it. I'm going to show you some data that shows it. Consumers have done the opposite. They've come to beef because I think largely driven out of that trading out of especially high-end steakhouse, maybe even fast casual dining steak meals. For the most part, you can go to a retail grocery store or a club store and have that same kind of eating experience. And we've taught consumers through COVID, with the closure of those restaurants, they've experimented enough times, they figured out at least one way they can do it. I've got a 17-year-old son that figured out how to take a cast iron pan, 2 sticks of butter, and 2 ribeyes and make a great steak. If you can teach him to do it, because he can't make mac and cheese, any of the rest of us can do it. So that's just a fun example of how accessible our product is, and easy to do it. I mean, it's not that you can't mess up a steak. It's just with the marbling content, it's a little more forgiving. I shouldn't say a little. It's a lot more forgiving than a pork chop, even at the same thickness, which is a challenge. There's some club stores that have figured that thicker pork chop maybe has a little better opportunity to get to not overdone, which most of them land at anyway. So chart on the right here is some data we work on real per capita expenditures, maybe an easier way to think about it versus a demand index. We've seen since last July, beef spending, so this is real per capita, so it's deflated dollars back to 2014. We've taken about $1 a month per capita out of pork and poultry spending. Similar to Chris's data, if you look at total spending or on a per capita basis, either one, beef dollars monthly are about double either pork or poultry. Or if you simpler said, if you add pork and poultry spending together, you get roughly about beef spending across the whole system. So that's a great opportunity for beef. Our next slide, Brian, I think we're going to transition in here to looking at some individual cuts. I'm going to use the Denver market because it's what I live in. I live north of Denver, about an hour. We've seen some very aggressive beef marketing amongst the two big retailers here. Starting back at Christmas, New Year's, we've had the opportunity to buy bone-in ribeye choice steaks or whole bone-in prime ribs or half prime ribs under $6. I look back in the data, we haven't had export ribs, these 109Es that turn into bone-in rib steaks, under $6. Or how about those ad prices are $5.37 and $5.77 this week between Safeway and King Soopers. You're all are going to go look for them anyway, so I'll just tell you who to go look at. We haven't had prices below those ad prices in the wholesale market for a long time. You got to go back to either April of 2020 or February of 2017 to get export rib prices in the low fives. So that would have been like $5.27, $5.28. So what it says to me is retailers, and today they're willing to spend $3 a pound of revenue from somewhere else in the store to get people in the store to buy those. To Chris's point, those baskets across many, many retailers that include beef or especially include steaks are bigger baskets. So they're using that as an opportunity, and they're willing to spend $50 or $60 per primal in terms of ad spend or buying down that ad price using money from somewhere else in the store. And you can see on the right, the chart on the right, there's a lot of noise in there, and I left it there for this example. Retailers that are very ad driven, so not the everyday low cost guys, but the promotional driven retailer sees this, and in the last year or so, we've seen a lot more volatility and spacing out of ads to get that price impression. Really, they have to do it the first or second week of the month to get that thing to get the lift that it needs in terms of sales dollars for the store. So we've seen those maybe a little less frequently in terms of ads, and then you get these kind of price swings going around as well. Our next slide, as I get going, because I'm going to burn up too much time if I don't. Here's a quick look at strip loins. In my cursory view of ads for the 4th of July, I found just one strip ad, and I didn't look exclusively at all the retailers. It's just one popped out of a whole bunch of ribeye ads. So there's some of that going on. The challenge with ribs, as you can see on the chart on the left, from a wholesale standpoint, you've not had a really great buying opportunity as a retailer, and so it's a little more consistent in terms of price, in terms of the ad price. So the red line on the right chart, that's the average price in the ad. And then, we've seen some more volatility in terms of ad occurrence, but not as good an opportunity here. We'll see those ads probably for Labor Day as we get better strip pricing. Our next slide, Brian, here's top butts. If you think about alternatives, if you're in a market demographic that, ribs and strips maybe don't fit, top loin or top butts and sirloins probably work better. And we've seen that more frequently advertised over the last 6 to 12 months, but it doesn't have the price advantage that it had because there's a lot more people there. And then it's one of the places where you see food service moving to putting a sirloin steak in a restaurant menu or as a special in their marketplace to get that plate cost kind of back in line. So not as big an opportunity there as what we've seen historically. And Brian, I think our next one, my last one, here a quick look at ground beef. We saw in Chris's stuff how popular ground beef is. We can see it across all of the lean points. I just threw the 73s in here because that's probably where we compete the most with food service from a pricing standpoint. Ad prices this week for 80% lean ground beef, about $3.25 to $3.50 a pound. That's about a break even for the store because cost is about $3. 73 trim about the same, or ground beef about the same margin opportunity. They can at least get those ads to break even and not have to subsidize them, and still getting really good lift in the process. So I think, Brian, that was my last one, and I'll hand it back to you.
All right, thanks, Dave. I know you're passionate on that side of it, and appreciate all the insight. We look at a lot of the same data, and appreciate when you have the backstory of years of experience, working on the beef side. So we're going to switch focus here a little bit, talking about pork and chicken, and I kind of see these two as trying to find or to try to show the consumer value in the meat case this year. And there's some different dynamics there. I'm going to start off with kind of what we're seeing on the pork side, or in general, the retail meat prices. Chris was talking about this a little bit, but in general, what we're talking about from a value standpoint, looking at ground beef, chicken breast, pork chop, those sort of items, we had a pretty strong increase in retail chicken prices through 2022 and 2023. When we index those back to the 2019 levels or pre-pandemic, I think in that time frame, all three of those categories have really kind of been trending similar in terms of the inflation that we're seeing. Steak items still kind of taking the cake with passing on some higher prices. So still talking about, like I said, pork and chicken, and thinking about that side of the equation. Overall, when I'm kind of looking at what we've seen so far this year for the pork side of the equation, in that sector, we had this question earlier, thinking about attracting the dollars and the volume, or extracting that from a consumer standpoint. Pork has kind of struggled here over the last couple of years. The number one item, pork item that consumers are thinking about is bacon, and it's thinking about how does that conversation change from a domestic standpoint. Also thinking about the export side of it, we've seen some record type exports out of the pork industry this year. Part of that's bolstered by the peso kind of keeping pace with the U.S. It's been disrupted over the last month or so, but overall, I think the outlook looks pretty optimistic for U.S. pork exports. From a production standpoint, things appear to be pretty steady. And finally, we're starting to see some data on how Prop 12 has impacted. I dug into that a little bit. We'll go to that next. But California implemented this Prop 12, which puts restrictions on how hogs or sows are raised and able to produce to supply the California market. I broke down looking at retail feature activity around pork. This is comparing national level activity to what we're seeing in the southwest markets, not specifically California, but if you look back at 2020, 2021 timeframe, the amount of retail feature activity around pork, changed lower for the southwest markets versus national. Looking at that now, actually, we're seeing kind of this breakdown where year over year change. They're shying away from the pork item. It's a little bit more evident in this next chart. Where overall Southwest region has gravitated towards more pork, and now we're seeing this kind of disconnect in terms of what's going on in that Southwest market. So again, not specifically looking at California, but that data is in there, so it's not quite as drilled down to the specific states. So that thought this year, we have expectations that consumers are gravitating more towards ground beef and to try and battle against inflation. We're going to have more burgers on the menu. We've seen some shying away from bacon at retail and food service over the last couple of years, just with those high bacon prices, high belly prices, and low stocks that we saw in 2021, 2022. Last year, we saw higher inventories on bellies. So, overall, we're kind of back in this range where we're getting more quote unquote normalization for bacon. And I noted on this slide, we're just ahead of BLT season. Usually August is kind of where we start seeing these ads come into play for bacon on the menu, right as those tomatoes get ripened, and somehow those two things coincide together. So I'm expecting we might see some better prices on bacon for the consumer this year. A lot of that stemming from what we're seeing. I think Prop 12 plays into it, but overall the market in general seems like it's poised for opportunity there. So was that the U.S. Meat Export Federation? And this, I apologize, this slide didn't quite come out right, but U.S. Meat Export Federation back in May, and pork loins has been one of those items, Chris referenced, thinking about how do we get consumers to cook these really kind of bigger roast items, and loins is one of those that seems to be struggling from a domestic standpoint. The challenge, and I saw a lot of marketing around pork loins in foreign markets from USMEF representatives. And it seems to have charged somewhat the market this year in terms of domestic prices. But they had this fascinating method for cooking pork loins. It was taking a loincloth or a burlap material, covering that with wine and salt, and then placing that directly on hot coals for about 45 minutes. The results were fantastic. If you want the details, please email me. But they had this challenge, and I went for it, and had great results from that. But wanted to share that. Another thing we're seeing, thinking about back ribs, that's probably sits right up at the top of my choice in terms of what I'm looking to put on the grill this summer. And there's been a new thing this year, thinking about air fryers and grilling, this party rib craze. I don't know if other folks are seeing this, but it seems like it's popping up on my feed more and more. And overall, ribs seem to be situated pretty well from a price standpoint to show value to the consumer and a great item. But I looked at the cold storage numbers. We're at a 10-year low right now in terms of ribs sitting in the freezer. So potentially some tight supplies at the peak of grilling season here. But overall, yeah, that's my grill. And we did this vortex method, which is essentially creating an air fryer out of a Weber. So and finally, thinking about production, harvest of sows has been up this year as a percent of total slaughter. Production, moderate change when compared with a year ago for overall pork. This could give us some more sausage type items, I think, as grills are heating up this year. Probably going to see that out of the increase of sows coming to market. So briefly on the broiler side, I know we're getting tight on time, but overall the production seems really pretty steady this year. The front end intentions are suggesting that the broiler industry is looking to expand, but there's been some things that I'm picking up are they're struggling with genetics a little bit, in that they've bred the bird for a multitude of different genetic characteristics. But they're seeing a drop in productivity rate from the layers. And in addition to that, there's this metanuvo virus that is causing some issues with hatchability. So our outlook is pretty moderate in terms of overall growth for the broiler industry, despite some really pretty strong profits that are coming across for that area. So we'll kind of get through this a little bit, but so overall production, pretty good shape this year, addressing the needs of the consumer to see that value type item on shelf. The broiler industry is doing what they can. They're bringing around higher average live weights this year. It's really kind of on trend that we continue to see these live weights work their way higher, despite harvest rates that are kind of similar with what we've seen last year. I had this question. There was a Wall Street article not too long ago that was talking about how far does a $100 bill go at the grocery store. I put together a LinkedIn update just kind of thinking about that question. And one of the statements that was made in this article was chicken is always on sale somewhere. So I pulled the retail feature activity data for chicken breasts all the way back to 2013, right? I'm like, it is always on ad somewhere, it seems like. And if you look at this year's data, so far, the blue bar is retail feature activity. So this is the amount of stores featuring it. and we're above 2020 levels. We're right in line with where we were in 2019. And if you look at the price, which is the orange bar or the orange line, we're at an average of 235 on those features. So the everyday price sitting around $4 a pound for chicken breast, but your ad price is 235. Now that's actually it's lower than what we were at in 2022. We're down a little bit from 23. But if you look back to 2013, we're actually lower than what prices were back then, and we've got more feature activity. So consumers are actually seeing a lower price on chicken breast than what they were a decade ago. So Chris mentioned dark meat. Overall prices seem pretty well supported for leg quarters, despite exports being lower this year. This is typically a strong export item, and Mexico's kind of is top destination for U.S. poultry. Thinking about this, cold storage inventories, it's typically either staging or excess product off of the market. And cold storage inventories are actually pretty low for leg quarters, and our export volume is actually down on this item too. So to Chris's point, we're seeing better traction from a U.S. perspective on dark meat. Finally, we don't see wings on the grill that often, but I think this is a good item. I'm showing a picture here that probably looks pretty delicious for lunchtime. This was actually our turn-in this year for Memphis in May for the wing category. We did pretty good on that, but overall prices seem to be improving for the wing category. Had some difficulty back in 22 and 23 after some folks took that off of the menus. So looking in better shape this year. With that, I don't know if we have time for questions, Paul, but I'll send it back to you briefly.
Yeah, it looks like we're just about to be at the top of the hour here. So it's about 11:58 Mountain Standard Time. So yeah, we do have some times for some questions. So please use that chat feature at the end. And while we do that, I just would like to thank, of course, all of our guest speakers today, including Brian, Dave, and Chris. Thank you for your time. Very informative. And again, the recording of this will be available, and the deck. I will try to get it out before July 4th. So look for an email for that, and you'll have access to that. So again, thanks for everyone's time. Please, if you have questions, ask them now. But we'll try to end here on time today. It's at high noon. So any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature.
Well, there is one question there that I can take. Sorry, I guess my throat kind of died. One question was sort of, can the pork industry learn something from the chicken thighs, e.g. marbling? And I thought, that is a great point on that side. To me, that's exactly where the pork industry needs to go, which is, creating that extra flavorful meat, folk getting more to the higher quality, higher color on that side, one, but then two, the convenience side of it. So the whole thing about boneless thighs, how did it go to 700 million plus and growing faster than everything else? It's that convenience aspect. The whole idea that you can put that in a regular tray of, call it 1 to 1 3/4 pounds at a really good price. So that the idea of convenience matters is one of the single biggest things that I see chicken doing better than almost every other protein.
Yeah, I mentioned air fryers briefly. I read a statistic that there's more air fryers in Americans' homes now than coffee makers. So it's a more common appliance. And if you look at what the chicken industry has available for convenience, it's very heavily gravitating towards that air fryer, right? So there's opportunity there, I think.
And I'm gonna have to up my picture game on menu stuff. One I would throw out there, if you're looking for an air fryer pork recipe, take thick cut pork chops, more than an inch thick, cube them, toss them with your favorite barbecue seasoning, 7.5 minutes, 375 in your air fryer, and it's like pork shish kebabs without the work.
Nice.
Now, the more that hits social media and other things like that as an idea, I mean, hate to say it, that's all part of it. That's a perfect description of how to make it more convenient.
Yep. think there's a last question that popped in here on strength of the dollar having a bigger impact on pork industry more than changes in consumer preferences. I would say it's probably regional, just because the Chinese dollar, Chinese currency is fixed to the U.S. dollar. Not as big an impact there, but they've got their own internal challenges from a pork volume standpoint. But if you looked at, say, Mexico, Korea, Japan, absolutely the case.
All right, I think that will actually conclude our webinar today. Again, thank you all for joining on. I know if you stayed a couple of minutes late, so I appreciate that. And again, look for that email to come out here before the 4th of July. Everyone have a great holiday, great weekend coming up, and hopefully we'll see you back soon.